Okay, so good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Future Leaders Group Session 6. We have our guest speaker, Simon Wardley, here today, who is going to be talking through the ways and means of industrialisation. Just a little bit of introduction about what the Future Leaders Group is. We're a collection of individuals who are interested in open technologies, including open source software, hardware, and data. And we include a wide range of people that work in technology, intellectual property, outsourcing, procurement, data, innovation, as well as private practice lawyers and in-house counsel who work in the technology sector and related fields. We operate underneath the OpenUK Legal and Policy Committee, and we are hoping to bring together and develop future leaders in legal and policy matters relating to open technologies and support and further the mission of the Legal and Policy Committee. It's currently co-chaired by me and one of my colleagues, Katie Gibson. She's at Bristow's and I'm at Phil Fisher. And we're always open to new ideas and to new members. So if anyone would like to get involved in our activities just dip into certain ones that we're doing, please just reach out to one of us. I will just now hand over to Amanda Brock, CEO of OpenUK, to properly introduce our speaker for the day.
Thanks very much, Rob. It's a real honour this afternoon to be able to introduce Simon Wardley to you. I think you all actually know Simon, so you probably don't need an introduction, but Simon is a researcher. When I asked what he wanted to be introduced as, he said a researcher, my friend, etc. So I've got to work out the etc. If you look at Simon's bio, you'll see that he's an expert in cloud. He's the inventor of Wardley mapping, and he's on a number of advisory boards. I met Simon about 10 years ago when we both worked at Canonical, where he was very instrumental in Ubuntu's positioning in the cloud market, which I'm sure he'll touch on at some point in this presentation today. I knew him as this nice bloke who appeared one day and started to chat to me about cloud, and then was really helpful to me in explaining things. He was really good at getting somebody who didn't have a very long open source background at that time, understanding things, contextualizing. So I knew he was a pretty good explainer of concepts, and I knew that he spoke very well, and I liked his presentations because they had lots and lots of funny slides in them. It was only a couple of years ago when I was looking up the best speakers in open source in the world, and Simon came up, that I realized that it wasn't just me who thought he was a good speaker, that everybody does. So I'm not surprised we've got a really good turnout today for you, Simon. We'll hand you over to you for about 40-50 minutes. We will open to questions at the end. Unfortunately, there is a function on a big blue button. If anybody finds it, please put it in the chat to raise your hand, but we can't find it today. So if you have questions, it's our first big blue button outing, as you know, please put your questions in the public chat and I will introduce you at the end to Simon for questions. So with that, I'm going to hand over to you, Simon. Thanks very much for doing this today.
Thank you very much. Sorry if you may have noticed me moving around the pen on the screen, just trying to see if I get my whiteboard working. Thank you for the introduction. That's very kind. Of course, this presentation, there will be no jokes. It's all really serious stuff. But hopefully you'll find it interesting. I was going to draw a few maps for you, but unless some sort of magic happens along the way, I don't seem to be able to get that side working. I'm going to give it a try, though. So this is all about the ways and means of industrialization. So what do I mean by that subject? Ooh, I have to, bizarrely enough, use the pointer to move slide. I'm going to talk about the issue of maps. Then I'm going to talk about the concept of industrialization itself. Then I'm going to talk about the impact of this, talk about some of my current research, and then talk about what's happening next. So this is really focused on maps and what is changing in our economy at the moment. It seemed a timely thing. Lots of people talking about the impact of coronavirus and, in terms of the economy. So I wanted to talk about that from a mapping perspective. Now, before I start, I better explain what a map is. So all maps are imperfect representations of a space. So this is a map of France. It's not a perfect map of France. That doesn't mean it's not useful. In order to be a perfect representation, it would have to be one-to-one scale, which means it would have to be the size of France, which therefore means it would be France. So all maps are inherently imperfect representations of a space. Now, unfortunately, we've discovered a whole bunch of things about Blue Button as we went along, and WebRTC and how it interacts with or doesn't interact so well with 4G networks. So I'm running on my BT fibre to the cabinet line. So I'll try and go slowly because it can be pretty atrocious at points in terms of bandwidth. Well, we are in the UK. All right. So maps are a way of exploring and understanding a landscape. So why does that matter? So to understand that, we have to go back to what I call the strategy cycle. So the first thing in the strategy cycle is you've got to have a purpose, sort of a moral imperative, something you're trying to do or achieve. It doesn't matter what it is. It could be winning a game of chess. The next step is to understand the landscape that you're actually competing in. And that's what maps are for. It's about getting a common understanding of an environment that you're actually competing in. The next thing you do is you learn patterns from the maps. Now, the first type of patterns are what we call climatic patterns. So these are economic patterns, and they're useful for anticipation. There's about 30 of them. So you use these to understand how the map will actually change. The next step after that is you've got to orientate yourself around that landscape and how it's changing. And for that, we use what we call doctrinal principles. And there's about 40 of those that have come from mapping. And they're obvious things like focus on user needs, use appropriate methods. Agile, it doesn't fit everywhere. You need to use multiple methods. And once you get beyond that, then you get into the gameplay. So you've got a map, an understanding of your landscape. You can see the common economic patterns, how it's changing. Now you look at how you manipulate that space to your favor. And there's about 100 different ways of doing that. And then you act. And then, of course, when you act, that may change your purpose. It will impact the landscape. So you have to go through this whole process and this whole cycle again. Now, this particular cycle was described by Sun Tzu as the 5 factors. I prefer John Boyd's OODA loop. So it's all about observing the environment, orientating yourself around it, deciding where you're going to act, and then just repeating the entire process. Okay, so let me move on to my next slide. Right, so one of the problems that we have is a lot of things that we in business that we call maps actually aren't maps. They're graphs. So we have lots of things like mind maps, systems maps, business process maps, but they're all graphs. They're not actually maps. Now, how do we make a distinction between the two? I put in simple form. These 3 graphs at the top are the same. Nottingham, London, Dover, Nottingham, London, Dover, Nottingham, London, Dover. They're 3 nodes all connected by 2 roads, M1, M2. Now, the 3 maps at the bottom are all different. Now, the difference between a graph and a map is that in a map, the space actually has meaning. So if you move bits around in a map, it changes the context and the meaning of the map itself. So if you take something like a mind map, which people call a map, and you move components, it doesn't change the context. And that's because it's not really a map, it's a graph. And it's the same with most business process maps and systems maps. They're not actually maps, they're graphs. Now, maps are really useful for learning and understanding about a landscape and how it changes. And that's why we tend to use them. All right. So how do you create a map in business? Well, there are 3 characteristics that any map must have in order for space to have meaning. The first characteristic is you need to have an anchor. So geographic maps, you have magnetic north. In the case of a business map, we use multiple anchors, the customer, the business, there could be the regulators, so government. You can have many anchors, so it doesn't have to be one. But these are the things which the map is orientated itself around. Okay, so we have multiple anchors, but the other 2 characteristics we need are position and consistency of movement. So how do we do position? Well, fortunately, all our anchors, doesn't matter whether it's business or government or regulators or whoever, all have needs. And those needs have needs themselves. So if you think about a cup of tea, I have a need for a cup of tea. But a cup of tea, well, it has needs. It has a need for a cup. It needs hot water. It also needs tea. And hot water, it has needs. It needs cold water, and you need a kettle. And a kettle has needs. It needs power. So what you can do is create a chain of needs. And you can do this in business as well. And so position comes from that chain of needs. So just how far away or near you are to for example, the consumer. So in this case, customer wants online photo storage, needs a website, needs a platform, needs compute, needs power. Power is quite far away. The consumer is going to be interacting with your website. Their knowledge, understanding of what power you're using to power your data center. This map is actually from 2005. You wouldn't do it this way today. But anyway, their understanding of power is very distant from them. They don't care. They wouldn't know. So now we've got anchor and position described through a chain of needs. Now, the next thing we need is consistency of movement. Now, it's very fortunate that everything evolves through a common pattern. All forms of capital, doesn't matter whether we're talking physical activities, practices, data, or knowledge, seem to go through common stages of evolution. So you start off with the genesis of the novel and new, often custom-built examples of things, then products and rental services, and eventually commodity and utility services. And that's all driven by supply and demand competition. So what we can do is just put an axis at the bottom, simply to describe the Genesis custom-built product commodity, and we just put the components roughly where we feel they are, and now we've got a very imperfect map with anchor, position, and movement. And if I move any component, of course, it changes the context. Great. So at this point, I was going to give you an example and draw you a map, but due to the fineness of the technology, I seem to be limited to doing single dots. So we're going to have to skip that bit, I'm afraid. The only other thing I would say is that as things evolve from left to right, the characteristics change, which is why we say it's uncharted at the top, industrialized on the right-hand side. Doesn't matter what it is, money, computing, penicillin, it all goes through the same sort of path. So agile development, very good on the left-hand side, not so good on the right-hand side, where things like Six Sigma work well, leads very good in the middle. That's one of the basic lessons of doctrine you learn. Anyway, we'll have to skip that bit, I'm afraid. And if you want to learn more about maps, there's an online course, learn.leadingedgeforum.com. You can go there. There's also, I've written a 19-chapter book. It's all Creative Commons, share alike, help yourself. There's entire online communities as well, teaching people how to map. So if you go medium.com, Wardley Maps, you'll find the book, help yourself. If you go to, just have a search online, there's list.wardleymaps.com, sends you to a GitHub awesome list, basically, which lists all these different resources, constantly being updated. There's an entire community. It's all done in a Creative Commons way. All right. Anyway, this is not about teaching you how to map. I wanted to talk about industrialization. It's one of those terms which I get quite excited by. So I better explain why. So back in 2011, I did this particular table, published this table. It was an examination of different types of organization. I'm a genetic engineer by training, so I did some population genetics study on companies themselves. And back in 2011, there was very much a traditional style of company, departmental, lots of inertia, focused on profit. Open source was seen as a way of cost reduction. Learning was analyst. Big data they used. Resilience was all N+1 and disaster recovery tests. But there was also this next generation of organization, different structures, service, cell-based, saw culture as more fluid and gameable. Now, some of these were small, but some of these are more absolute monsters of companies. Corporate focus, much more of disruption of pre-existing industries. Open source seen as a weapon, a way of changing a market to your favor. Learning was very much from ecosystems, big data driven by resilience, designed for failure, and rather disaster recovery. They were using chaos engines like Chaos Monkey, Netflix, etc. So this was back in 2011 when I published this. A lot of people in the enterprise world said, oh, no, that's just startups. Well, it wasn't. And over the 9 years after that, more and more companies have tried to emulate that next generation. But what I want to talk about is, how did I create that table? Now, to understand that, I have to teach you a few little basics. First of all technology not only diffuses in society like a virus, it also evolves. And that evolution occurs through multiple waves of diffusion. So when we talk about compute, and we talk about the evolution of compute, starting off with the Z3 in 1943, point one, and then moving on to custom-built systems like Lions Electronic Office, and then moving on to early products like the IBM 650, and then improving products until eventually you got utility compute with people like Amazon, the EC2. What you had was a number of different steps, each of which diffused in society from early adopters to laggards. Now, the diffusion curve stuff is Everett Rogers' work, made famous by Geoffrey Moore, Crossing the Chasm. So when we think about compute, it evolved through multiple instances and multiple ways of diffusion. And so often you'll find the early adopters to one set are the laggards to another. So often the early adopters to things like product-based compute had big data centers, huge numbers of servers. Of course, were the laggards, and they had resistance to adopting more utility forms like Amazon. So the first thing to remember is that everything not only diffuses, it also evolves. Okay. Now, one of the most interesting parts, as far as I'm concerned, is when we move from this product to more utility phase. Now, I just randomly created 7 stages that actually compute. There are hundreds of different instances, each diffusing. But what happens is compute was part of a larger value chain. So you go, user wants an application, best coding practice, built on a runtime operating system, best architectural practice, using compute as a product. And then what happens? Oops. I jumped ahead one. Then what happens is compute jumps that boundary. It goes from product to utility. And this is actually was occurring 2006. And that enabled a new emerging practice to appear and new needs to be met. Now, why that occurs is because the characteristics change. So if you think about compute as a product, it was high MTTR, high mean time to recovery. So which is why we did things like capacity planning, N+1 disaster recovery. Because if your machine went bang, it took you months to get a new one. With the utility world, it's low MTTR. So your machine goes bang, and it takes seconds to get a new one. So now we can distribute systems, design for failure, chaos engines. And we can do things like continuous deployment because we're not waiting several months for machines to turn up. So all of a sudden, a new set of emerging practices appear. And of course, that enables us to create new needs, new types of application, new things that we couldn't do before, things like Netflix. Okay. Now, this change, the shift from product to utility, caused an explosion of new things, new practices, is actually common throughout history. We call them ages. So if you look at the agricultural revolution, industrial revolution, age of steam and transport, they're all caused by industrialization of underlying technology. So probably the one everybody talks about is the age of electricity. Well, Tesla and Westinghouse didn't create electricity. You had the Parthian battery as an artificial source of electricity long before them. In fact, we had products like Siemens generators before Tesla and Westinghouse were on the scene. What they did was they turned it from a product into a utility. They industrialized the space. And it's that bit which causes the explosion of higher order systems, the change of practice. And that's the bit I find exciting. Okay. Now, whilst it's exciting, we also have inertia to the change. And we have inertia to the change caused by pre-existing practice. So we've got best architectural practice in this computer example for the use of computer as a product. And so that creates resistance to the change of going to a utility and having to learn an entirely new set of emerging practice. We've also got resistance, which comes from the fact we've got pre-installed capital and past success. So I've got big data centers full of servers. So I've got a resistance to the change as well. Okay. But eventually, whether we have resistance or not, the change will happen. And when it does, you'll see capital flow from those past areas to the new areas. So it moves out of computers as a product into more computers as a utility, and that becomes more future investment. And it also moves into those new industries and new things being created on top. And that's normal. And we actually have a term for that. We call that creative destruction. Oops, sorry, just a phone going off. We actually call that creative destruction. So basically, Joseph Schumpeter talked about the capitalist engine, that the fundamental impulse, that keeps the capitalist engine in motion, is all about the creation of the novel and new stuff. But that also requires the destruction of the past, which is stuck behind those inertia barriers. It's all perfectly normal. Okay. So that's overall a standard path of industrialization. And I've just generalized it a bit more. So what we have is some user has a need for some component. That component makes a shift from product to utility. We have inertia to the change because of pre-existing practices, pre-existing capital. As the change happens, we see flow of capital from the past to the future world. We see this new emerging practice, and we also see these new needs being met. All very exciting stuff. Now, in order for this to actually happen, you need 4 factors in place. You need concept, suitability, technology, and you need attitude. So the idea of producing, say, a theatre in a virtual world, I mean, the concept's been there for ages. The technology's been there for ages. Is it suitable, widespread, well-defined enough? Can we do that sort of thing? Yes. Attitude, well, really, people aren't so keen. They like the social experience, etc. Same thing with compute, going from product to more of a utility. The concept was back in the 1960s. It was suitable. It had been around for ages. Everything was there. The critical thing was the attitude. Now, fortunately, back in 2006, people had got so fed up with servers and the cost of it and everything else, that somebody came along and just initiated the change, and that was Amazon with EC2. Sometimes what happens is you have a forcing need, some sort of forcing function. Oh, hang on, I'm seeing lots of comments on the side. Let me just double check. Hopefully, some people are seeing some 4G connection problem. Hopefully you can hear me. Amanda, I don't know if you can just put a chat. Can you all hear me?
You're good for just keep going for now.
All good.
Okay.
Thank you.
All good. Right, no problem. Just double checking because I just saw all these comments going on the side. Right, no problem. Anyway, so what happens is sometimes you get a forcing function, which makes that change happen. So the classic example of this would be New York City at the turn of the century. So back in the turn of the 20th century, so back in the 1900s, New York City had a big problem, which was mountains of horse poop. There were so many horses, and there was so much poop. It was literally built up on the sides, on the street, stunk the place out and everything else. So that created that attitude, that desire to change the situation, which is why it rapidly converted to motor cars. And it was in the space of about 10 to 12 years. Total transformation from horses to motor cars. Okay. So what we have, you have a value chain. You often have components, they're evolving. We have inertia to the change. When it does change, we have flows of capital. It creates new practices, new needs, and sometimes we'll have a forcing function, some sort of forcing need, which will make that change happen. Okay. And it's such a common pattern, we give it a name. We call it peace, war, and wonder. You have the wonder of new things, like the wonder of radio, peaceful stage of large giants building up my radio, better than your product, etc., blah, buy this person's radio, whatever it happens to be. They all build inertia to change, new entrant comes in, usually not encumbered by a pre-existing business model. So in computing, it was a bookseller. That causes the total change of the industry. And that goes all the way up and down the stack. So it's happening with Runtime at the moment. The whole runtime is shifting from .NET to Lambda. So we're shifting from product to utility based. Of course, half the industry is worried about stuff that really is low level, doesn't matter, Kubernetes or containers, who cares? I mean, the shift is actually moving up. And it's normal. We all have inertia. It's all perfectly normal. Okay, so let's talk about impact then. So back in 2011, I just spent the previous few years at Canonical helping them get into cloud, attack the space when everybody else had inertia. So we knew this was going on. So we knew that the cloud was in this state of war. We're seeing these new emerging practices. So I was able to go and explore, run a population study to see whether there was a separation of difference in companies. And so I would go and talk to companies and say, you know, do you open source stuff that's a source of differential advantage? And the answer was no. And didn't matter whether they were next generation traditional, they were almost identical. They strongly agreed they didn't open source stuff that was a differential advantage. And there were a long, long list of characteristics they were identical on. Innovation, collaboration, all that sort of stuff. But here's the interesting bit. There were some characteristics they were fundamentally different on. So our company deploys an open technology approach as a means of outmaneuvering competitors. This next generation strongly agreed, traditional, like, oh, we don't do any of that sort of stuff. And so that's where this table came from. It was simply, we used the maps to identify that this point of war was occurring, that we should see this emerging practice, and in this emerging practice, we should see a new form of organization appears. And this also occurs throughout history. So if you go back to each of those previous ages, not only is it caused by the industrialization of some components, you also get new forms of organization with new forms of practices appearing. So the agricultural revolution, we saw commercial farmers and markets. Industrial, we saw the American system of engineering time management. Age of steam and transport, we saw the joint stock company, etc. And so all that was happening was we were getting this industrialization of an underlying component, creating these new practices, creating this new form of organization, which included things like DevOps in its practices. So that brings me to my research. Now, what am I doing today? Well, one of the beauties about the maps, oh, hang on a second, my young boy, everything all right?
How do I change this meeting?
Oh, hang on, my apologies. Being technology support for the family. Which one is this? Alice's one?
Yes.
Like that. Send Alice an email and ask her to send you details. Apologies for that. Anyway, so if you look at a map, if you look at the bottom of the map, you've got the axis of Genesis, custom built, product, and commodity. And that axis actually comes from this curve. This is the piece of work that I did in 2005, looking at how capital evolved. So you start off with the Genesis, novel new things, custom built, product, commodity on axes of ubiquity and certainty. It's driven by supply and demand competition. Now that actually comes from this, publication types. So the frequency of publication types changes as things evolve. So publications, to begin with, talk about the wonder of something, like the wonder of radio, then building construction awareness, my radio is better or worse, or how to build your own crystal radio, I should say. Then they get into operation, maintenance, and feature differentiation. My radio is worse or better than yours. And finally, they get into use. So I don't care about how you build or construct your radio, your features. I want to know what's on the radio types. So you can use these frequency curves to create a weak signal to identify these points of industrialization heading towards us. And that's useful because if we know they're heading towards us, we know at that point we're going to see explosion of novel and new practices, new forms of organization, disruption of past companies stuck behind inertia barriers, movement of capital flow, and there's loads of things that we can now do to exploit the situation. So anyway, that's what I did back in 2014. That was the weak signal analysis. And during the time 2020 to 2030, Robotics is likely to industrialize. We're going to see sensor as a service, a bit of immersive technology, 3D printing, even to genetic engineering, and other components are likely to become more industrialized, more ubiquitous, more standardized. And those are the key moments which cause explosions of change. Now, so I do a study tour, and which means I get a whole bunch of CIOs, different organizations and governments, and I take them on a bus and we go through Silicon Valley and we meet all these interesting companies. And of course, we had this planned this year. And we had companies like 6 Sense, which is using immersive technologies in hospitals, the use of robotics in hospitals, MakerBot, obviously 3D printing, and BrainCo, use of sensors, basically frightening stuff. Kids with sensors on their heads, monitoring whether they're working and concentrating or not, and obviously things in the space, because we're looking at industrialized space and things like 5G satellite, all that sort of stuff is going on. And of course, what happened is COVID-19 has happened in between us planning this and going to this event, and so we've had to adapt. And the interesting thing about COVID is actually acting as a forcing lead. This whole isolation economy, as in physical isolation, is driving the shift from product to more commodity of various components. And you see this companies running around to their digital transformation programs have suddenly accelerated. There was all this resistance to it. It wasn't like digital transformation or using the internet was new. It's just that had all this resistance. This has become a forcing function for this change. So a lot of people talk about us going back to how we were, and I'm not convinced. Anyway, how this impacts you depends upon your context. So when you talk about industrialization of technology and the emerging practices that occur, and remember things like open source are great ways of accelerating that industrialization, which is why we talk about it as a weapon or way of manipulating spaces. How it impacts depends upon the value chain of your industry. So for example, if you take something like retail, we might see industrialization of drones because we're going to see it accelerating. So we're going to see much more distributed retail delivery through drones. Now that has knock-on impacts in other industries. So if you think about defense, one of the anchors or the actors in this space would be a terrorist. Terrorists obviously they want to create terror, which requires a delivery mechanism and a payload, and that delivery mechanism may in the future be these more industrialized drones. So what happens in one industry can impact other industries as well. So you have to go back to the actual industry to work out what the impact is. So I'll give you a simple example, and mainly because it affected me. So from the point of view of a user wants to go to events. Events used to be a physical space. Now, of course, we've been able to industrialize and create virtual events. I mean, the first one I did was in 2006. So we've been able to do this for ages, and it comes with all sorts of benefits of efficiency. But we've sort of resisted against this because of the social aspects, because meeting people, shaking hands, all that sort of stuff, despite the fact we could recreate some of those social aspects in a more virtual world. It's really the physical isolation which is different. Anyway, by industrializing events, it allows for new practices and new needs to be created. And you're starting to see some of that emerging. Now we're doing much more virtual events. We're finding new ways of doing, dragging in more audiences, different ways of participating. That's actually occurring today. Now, those who are successful, we're going to see capital flow shifting out from the past areas. And what's driving this change is this sort of isolation economy. That's point E. So the COVID itself is driving this shift. And so let's go point F. Let's take you as a business. Let's suppose your business is about events and about that physical space itself. You're in this environment which is now changing, it's being forced to change because of the isolation economy. New practices are appearing. And so you've got inertia at point G because maybe you own the physical space. Maybe you've got all the practices that you've built up in terms of how to run events. This has all got to change in this new world. So what we're seeing out there at the market today is a lot of businesses, and it doesn't matter which industry that we're talking about, they have these whole old lines of business and physical events and the physical space. And they have this attitude. And the attitude is, we just need to survive, and then it's all going back. And that seriously exists out there. People are just like, let's just survive COVID, and then the economy and everything else will go back to exactly how it was. The reality is probably very different. You've also got a lot of businesses out there who are looking at these new lines. So that's creating events in terms of a virtual world, those new needs and those new emerging practices which are coming out of this. And so, you know, the experience to do this exists. Most are still in denial over the change, so it's great opportunity there. In terms of the new needs and new practices, well, you know, if you ask me what are they, nobody knows, because they're new, they're uncharted. We're just in the process of discovering those today. But the point about the maps is you can map it out, and we can actually use this to get a common agreement of where we need to focus, where we need to prioritize. So I was going to draw you a map, but as I said, my whiteboard isn't working. So we'll have to skip that one as well, I'm afraid. Technology for you. And so I'm just going to get on to what's next, that's all. I'm going to talk about what's next from my point of view. So this is what I'm doing. I know that these, and this is actually a call for help. I know that these changes, or the patterns would suggest these changes are going to occur. We're going to see industrialization across robotics, immersion, space, manufacturing, and sensors. That's going to be accelerated by this isolation economy. Open has a play in there as well. There will be some people who will deliberately open some of the stuff to accelerate that process, and that can be used to undermine competitors, all sorts of gameplay. Now, that's also going to impact industries in different ways. And at the same time, we're going to have this overriding isolation, as in physical isolation economy, driving this change as well, acting as a forcing function. So one of the things that I'm trying to deal with is I've got 5 technology changes, robotics, immersion, space, manufacturing, sensors, at least. 5 different industries I'm looking into: healthcare, defense, government, banking, automotive, because they're all going to be impacted. And we got this one forcing function in terms of COVID, and there may be others as well. And of course, we've got multiple shocks coming towards us as well. It's not just singular. So I'm putting together working groups in all of those spaces, because what we want to do is identify those patterns and create that new table. Remember the table I did in 2011, which used maps and all the rest of it to describe this is the future of organization? I'm going to try and rebuild this all. So it's a call to help anybody interested in this stuff, anybody who wants to get into more detail into the mapping and everything else. Right? It is all Creative Commons. You don't have to get involved, but you'd be very welcome to. Do get in contact, and I've put my details up. Hopefully the slide will appear. Oh, no, before that, what we're really doing is we're going to do a bit of future forecasting with weak signals, with maps and everything else, that are crystal gazing. Well, we did it in the past and it worked. We're going to find out whether it was a statistical fluke or whether we can actually realistically do this again. Anyway, if you're interested in getting involved in any of those working groups or anything else, you can either, there's my email address, or you can just grab me on Twitter, say, hey, I want to get involved, I want to learn a bit more mapping. We'd be delighted. The more opinions are useful, because it's a weak sensor approach. So we're looking for those practices which people, it's like early DevOps days. Before we had Andy and Patrick created the term DevOps, the practices were there. It just required somebody just to to come up with the word. Anyway, so that was my quick introduction to the concept of maps. I thought I'd pick on something useful and hopefully relevant to today with all the changes going on, and show an example of how you would use maps. It's all Creative Commons, help yourself. It's a massive field. It's pretty difficult to explain it all in 40 odd minutes, but hopefully you found that useful. Thank you.
Thanks, Simon. So straight away, I see Jory already has a question. Jory, do you want to jump in first?
Sure. So I'm kind of a nosy person. I have lots of questions. First off, thank you so much. This was fascinating, Simon, and I'm looking forward to reading more of your work. My question is about how you've seen the patterns that you've described, which is a totally new way of thinking about it for me. How have you seen those disrupt like the way we develop standards / establish standards? Because I know a lot of our current, you know what I mean?
Yeah, no. I totally. It's a fascinating subject, and thank you. One of the things about a map, I'm just going to go back. It's a real shame. I'm just going to give this another try. See if I can actually. Can I draw? Go on, let me draw.
Now beware that the rest of us might be.
Well, we'll do it as a collaborative exercise. There we are. Can somebody else draw a line from left to right? 50 lines appear. Yes, great, that's fine. Oh, that's a really nice line. Okay, so what happens is everything evolves from left to right. And as it evolves, its characteristics change. And there's something called the cheat sheet, which has a list of about 50 odd characteristics which describe these. So on the left-hand side, you're all about basically reducing the cost of change, because change is the norm. And then you're much more about learning and reducing waste. On the right-hand side, it's all about reducing deviation, because change is something you don't want. You're highly industrialized. So things like agile development, very strong on the left, and somebody's giving us all sorts of interesting writing, but that's okay. Stuff on the left is all about agile development. Stuff in the middle is all about lean, so Scrum, MVP, all that sort of stuff. Stuff on the right-hand side is more Six Sigma. So when you're building any massive scale system, you obviously have components at all stages, and they're all evolving from left to right. So you have to use multiple methods and techniques at the same time. Now, when it comes to standards, it's really interesting. And thank you so much for this, because obviously when things get industrialized, you want them to find standards as much as possible. What can happen is people try to standardize far too early. And in fact, if you start trying to standardize in those early stages, Genesis custom early product, you actually restrict the innovation and the evolution of the thing. It's far better to if you're going to use, where possible, to allow the market to develop it and de facto appear, and then drive it to the right by adopting and accepting it. Now, there are counterexamples. And those counterexamples normally come from specific user needs. So if you start mapping out something like the pharma industry, so you start off with investors, they want to invest money, get a return, and so your pharma industry, they want to sell a drug, and then you've got another user, the consumer, who needs to consume it. The user also wants to consume drugs and food that is safe for them. So they have another need, which is the stuff doesn't kill them. But from a pharma or even a food production point of view, the most market efficient way of doing that is simply insurance. You allow large numbers of people to die, but you insure against it. Fortunately for consumers, there's another actor in here, which is government, which also, consumers tend to be voters, and dead voters is not a vote winner. So voters create, the governments create regulators, and it's the regulators which create those the standards which meet those needs of those users. So what you often have is some sort of other need. In this case, it's the need not to be killed by drugs and whatever it happens to be, and some other actor, government, which generates those standards. And ideally, what you want to do is you want the market to develop as much as possible, usually in that product sort of space, and then drive it to the right. So you pick up the market de facto and adopt it. And ideally, in the perfect world, you do what China does. You declare it a utility, so you take all patent protection and everything else away from it. But it's not something we actually do, unfortunately, in the West. Does that answer your question? It's so much easier if I could draw a map. And I'm sorry, my pen is not working.
I think it does, but I think it's sort of interesting how this is related to some like history of standards in the industrialized era. There's like a book that I'm reading, and so there's some interesting and great sort of parallels here. So thank you very much.
No, pleasure, and thank you. I would love to hear more. If you could recommend the book, I'd be delighted.
I'll pop that in the chat for you.
Thank you very much.
So Simon, we have a question from Andrew Byers. Andrew, do you want to jump in?
Hi Simon, can you hear?
Yes, I can hear.
Yeah, fascinating. I've been using kind of mind maps for an awfully long time, and obviously doing them wrong. But I think the thought leadership that you're taking in here is fascinating. I love the idea of the dynamic tension, the thing that's pulling it and driving it across markets. But how do you take this, incredible level of thought and put it actually into execution?
Okay, so first of all, thank you very much. Oh, hang on. Oh no, it's just young boy. Sorry, family. Well, we live in that world. We're going to get used to more interruptions. So I've been doing mapping for 15 years. So I used it to run my company. I used it at Canonical, where me and Amanda were. I used it to map out the changes which were occurring with cloud. We used it to identify where to attack the market. I spent, 18 months, cost about $500,000. We were 3% of the operating system, roughly, against Red Hat Microsoft. We were 70-80% of cloud by the end of the 18 months. And so that's where, I don't know if people remember, it was all Red Hat, Microsoft, and then suddenly in cloud, it was all Ubuntu. That was us. And behind that were maps. So if you experienced that, you were mapped. I've used maps with things like building virtual worlds, HS2, and James Finley. It's used at the UN, reducing global poverty. It's been used in RNLI, reducing call-out times. So they got call-out times from about 14 minutes to 18 seconds. So that translates into actual saved lives. I was being told they reckon it's going to save about 1,000 lives a year, just because, you fall into the Thames. The lifeboat actually gets them, drags out living bodies now rather than dragging out dead bodies. So it's used. There's lots of people in Amazon who will talk about mapping. Adrian Cockcroft does some great talks, and there's several at Red Hat and other places as well. So it's used in commercial world. It's used in government. I used it to write something called the Better for Less paper, which led to transformations in government back in 2010. This was for Francis Maud. So it led to things like spend control and helped in the creation of something called GDS, Government Digital Services. So how do you start? Well, it's a skill. All maps are imperfect representations of the space. The first thing you have to realize is that most organizations operate on stories. By that creates actually a huge problem. Because if I have a story and I'm a storyteller, because I am telling you the story, and you challenge the story, you're actually challenging me personally. We spend all this time teaching execs that, the story, the problem was you're not a good enough storyteller. So when you're actually challenging the story, you're challenging them personally. And this is why it can always be pretty fractious. One of the things you're doing is, with a map, is you're getting the story and all the assumptions down on a map. And that enables me to challenge the map, not you. And so all of a sudden we find these wonderful examples of these big problems which are going nowhere. By putting them on a map, we can now actually challenge the map. Now, all maps are imperfect representations. So you have to accept it's not going to be right, but it at least allows us to create a common idea and a common understanding of a space and actually get some challenging in the process. And then what happens over time, it's like anything else, playing guitar, learning to play chess. You get better and better and you learn different patterns. And once you learn those patterns, you can start to use it for anticipation, and it just goes from there. Anyway, there's an entire 19 chapters of a book. It's about 600 pages, all free. Help yourself. Now, hang on 1 second. Yes, young man, what's up?
Just got this message. It says 44 something, no subject. Hello, here's a picture message.
All right. Well, don't worry. I will come and deal with whoever that is in a minute. There we are. Sorry, young boy. He's all online. Yes.
Yeah, we all are right now. Simon, I wonder if you could talk a little bit more, expand a little bit more on what you were saying about the work you did at Canonical, where I think it was over 70% of the cloud market ended up being Ubuntu.
Oh, God.
I know you use the maps and the whole open source thing. It'd be really interesting to hear a little bit more about that.
Oh, well, I remember the first, so interesting story. A friend of mine, Steve, I knew of Mark and we'd met beforehand anyway. Steve, Mark was looking for a designer. And a friend of mine, Steve, said, oh, you want to talk to Simon? He's a brilliant designer. So I turned up and I met Mark, and we met before, and Mark said to me, so you know all about design? I said, I know nothing about design. I am the worst designer you could possibly imagine. Oh, but you're here for a job as a designer. I said, well, that's me doomed. Let's talk about something else. And so I started talking maps, and I started talking about how the industry was changing and everything else. And when we got on, and Mark said, right, okay, you need to come here and help us shift from this product to this utility world. And I said, all right. So I started about a week later. And of course, the first 10 people I met, they said, what are you doing? And I said, I'm here to help us get into the cloud. And they were like, oh, that's a fad. That's just for startups. No one, we've got to win the enterprise space and blah, blah, blah. And so the first thing was just teaching people to understand the landscape and how it was changing and where we needed to focus. And that was a pretty quick exercise. We used to use the maps and draw them on big whiteboards. This is for, gosh, when was this? 2008, something like that. And we used that to identify where to focus. But I also mapped out Red Hat and Microsoft and identified points of inertia and weakness within them and how we could use their own sales processes against them. And there was all sorts of things. Great fun. But as you do in any competition with others, of course, we have a huge advantage. We can see the landscape and they couldn't. And so we simply use that. And a lot of it was also about stopping things. So there was this real temptation when people were helping us into the cloud, creating, Amazon images on with Ubuntu. There was always that natural tendency of, oh no, we've got to have official Ubuntu images. We better no, anything which helps us in our path and our direction to own this particular space. We're going to exploit. So the first step was getting everybody to understand the landscape, how it was changing, and how we had inertia to that change. Once that had happened, it was about where do we need to focus. So we knew there was going to be new practices developing. We didn't know it was going to be called DevOps later in the year, but I hired people like John Willis and others and got them into this space. But we knew any of the tools in that area we needed to own. Any of the new needs, we needed to help everybody get into that utility space, and we needed to own that utility space in terms of being the dominant operating system. And then there was all sorts of, I discovered that Red Hat salespeople got bonuses based upon Satellite, which is a security update system. So, we obviously messaged that all security updates should be free in the cloud, because obviously I got all the Red Hat people going, oh, I don't get a bonus if it's all free. Oh, this cloud stuff is fudge. You don't want to use it. So we helped people reinforce their own inertia to change, just to give us an easy runway into the space. And it took about 18 months, and then Ubuntu was everywhere. That's roughly the story.
Simon, what percentage of the market did you end up with?
I think it was about 70, 80%. I mean, we totally dominated the space.
Yeah,
it was great fun, but it's not my favorite ones are my favorite ones are things like the UN stuff that's going on at the moment, and RNLI in terms of I like the stuff which saves lives. I mean, there's all sorts of gameplay goes on in terms of serverless, that whole Lambda runtime, and in other commercial areas. Most of my interest is in the sort of saving lives, the defense space, all that sort of stuff. I think they are a different set of problems, and I like problems which aren't just money.
We're sort of at time, but we started a little late. So if you don't mind, can we have one more question? So,
you can have as many as you like.
oh, can we? Okay. Well, the next one is Terence Eden. Terence, are you still there? A few people have had to drop. Yeah, he is. Okay.
I'm not hearing anything.
Question. Terence, are you going to jump in with your question? If not, I'll read it out because he's put it in the chat.
Okay.
So Terence was asking, are there any areas where mapping does? Oh, he has no mic. Yeah, I've just to read it. Are there any areas where mapping doesn't apply?
Gosh, that's a really interesting question. Anything which is under competition and has an evolving form of capital. So physical activities, genesis, custom built product, commodity, practices, same stages, we just give different words: novel, emerging, good, and best. Data, a model, divergent, convergent model. Knowledge, concept, hypothesis, theory, becoming universally accepted. Even ethical values, concept emerging, converging, and accepted. These are just labels that we use at the bottom axis when dealing with those different areas. So physical activities, knowledge, data, practices, the combination of all, even values can be mapped. And one of the interesting ones is culture, because if you look through anthropology, an anthropologist, I think it's Klober, who said, they've been trying to agree a definition of culture, and no one can agree after 100 years what culture actually is. I mean, in terms of the anthropology, they can't come to a uniform definition. And part of the problem, as a wonderful anthropologist, Margaret Mead, who pointed out that language is part of culture. Now, if you know Gödel's incompleteness theorem, of course, if language is part of the model of culture, then you're never going to be able to create a complete and true representation of culture with language alone, which, of course, what people trying to do. But if you use those axes at the bottom, we go from concept emerging, converging, and accepted. And we're talking about ethical values. So concepts like, I don't know, universal basic income, all the way through workers' rights, all the way through to things like slavery and abolition. We start off with concept, eventually it becomes sort of accepted. And so what you can do is you can start to map values, you can start to map collectives, you can start to map behaviors, and you can actually generate a map of culture. Now, it's not a verbal description, it is a map, and it's an evolving map of multiple different components. So culture, you can map practices, businesses, activities, knowledge, data, as long as there's competition. Then as far as I'm aware, you can map it. If there isn't competition, then there's really no evolution. So you won't be able to. Now, does that mean your maps are right? Well, the tricky bit with maps is people have to come to terms with the fact that all maps are wrong, because fundamentally they're models. They're imperfect representations of a space. But if you can cope with that, turns out they're useful.
Simon, thank you. I think we probably have to draw questions to a close there because we are running a bit over. I'm going to hand over to Robert to wrap up. But before I do, for anybody on the chat who wants to delve into more of the different aspects in open source history, we have Neil McGovern, the Executive Director of the GNOME Foundation, speaking on the 5th of June. And he'll be picking up on some of what Simon was talking about with canonical Ubuntu, etc. He's going to talk about Debian, Ubuntu, GNOME, KDE, etc., all the operating systems and how they got to the stage of cloud, which will very much feed into what Simon's talked about today. Thanks again, Simon. I'm going to hand over to Rob now. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Amanda, and thank you very much, Simon, for that. That was a fantastic talk and really interesting and yeah, really useful. Just a little plug for our next session. We will have Pamela Chestic joining us from the OSI board. She's a US qualified attorney And I think it's fair enough to say she's one of the leaders in terms of open source trademarks and patent law. So yes, tune in, I think, back at our sort of more usual time at 12 o'clock next week on Friday for that talk as well. And thank you again, Simon.
Rob, sorry to interrupt you. It's 2 weeks' time next Friday's the bank holiday.
I forget about the bank holiday.
I was actually going to say I've mapped legal systems as well, and I mean by that the policies and the laws and everything within legal. It's a fascinating space. Anyway.
Simon, you're probably walking into helping the Future Leaders Group with their work that they're doing on public procurement. We should probably get you along to help them since you're volunteering there.
Okay.
Thanks.
Apparently so.
Thank you, everybody.
Pleasure.
Cheers.